back to my channel. Since April is National Poetry Month, I wanted to continue our poetry theme this week and share with you something for those older kids, for the upper elementary crowd. Novels in verse. These are a great way to engage your students in poetry in a little bit different of a way than picture books. While I still think that picture book poetry is still amazing for the older kids, make sure that you check out last week's video. I'll link it right here and in the description box down below, because those books still will work with your older students, but you can take it a step farther with novels in verse. If you are new here, my name is Sarah, and I show up every Sunday night on this YouTube channel because I want to bring you different ways to incorporate reading into your classroom every day of the week. I love sharing book ideas that you can use, as well as read aloud tips that I think will be helpful for you. As I mentioned before, I have 5 different novels in verse that I think would make great read alouds in your classroom. I'm sharing it for National Poetry Month, but really these novels in verse can be used at any time of the year. Let's check them out. The first book that I want to share with you is Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. In this novel, in verse, Jacqueline Woodson describes what it was like growing up in the 60s and 70s as a young African-American girl. We really get a glimpse into her soul as she finds her place in the world. And her poetry in the story really reflects the joy that she finds through writing, even though reading was difficult for her growing up. And how this love of stories really inspired her to become a writer, and an amazing one at that. If you have read any of her other picture books or novels, you'll know what an amazing writer she is. This novel in verse is really powerful, encouraging, and hopeful, and I highly recommend you sharing it with your class. The next one that I have for you to share is Love That Dog by Sharon Creech. Jack hates poetry, and he's not shy about it. He'll tell you that he really doesn't like poetry. But as the story goes on, Jack realizes that the more he writes, the more he finds out he actually has to say through poetry. I often find that poetry is something that students don't always love, and this book is a great way to show them that they can learn to appreciate it, and that the more they read it, the more they write it, the more they'll learn to love it. And as a follow-up to this book, there's also Hate That Cat, which follows the same characters and has a similar storyline. I do like this one better than Hate That Cat, but I think your students will like this, and it's a great one to start with for poetry. They'll connect with Jack, and it will help them get into the whole poetry experience a little bit easier. Another novel in verse that I have is The Red Pencil. This one's a little bit heavier of a story, a lot more in depth, a lot stronger. Again, this story is told in verse, and it is in the young girl's perspective. It's a moving story of survival and finding hope in the middle of the horrors of war in Sudan. But she addresses the complications of war in a way that students can understand and easy for them to comprehend. This would be a great book to pair with the novel A Long Walk to Water. The next novel in verse is one of my favorites. It is The Crossover by Kwame Alexander. This one is a story of family on and off the basketball court. It follows twins JD and Jordan Bell as they maneuver their way through middle school. Each chapter exhibits a different type of poetry that will be interesting for your students to interact with. And the themes of family, friendships, courage, sportsmanship are all woven throughout this story as well. I really think your students will enjoy this novel in verse. The next one I have is Inside Out and Back Again. Similar to The Red Pencil, this novel in verse is told from the perspective of a young girl. Her family is fleeing Saigon during the Vietnam War. As she arrives in America, she discovers that everything is different. There are very cold strangers, the food tastes different, and it's hard for her to find her place in this new country as she's struggling to learn English and understanding the new culture. But she also learns the strength of her own family. Another powerful novel in verse to share with your students during National Poetry Month. So while April is National Poetry Month, these novels in verse can be shared at any time of the year, and I think that they will really engage your students in learning a new type of text to read and encourage them to read them on their own as well. If this video was helpful for you, make sure you give it a thumbs up and hit that red subscribe button down below, because I'll be back next Sunday night with more read aloud tips and book ideas that you can use in your classroom. Have a great week.